Hey everyone, welcome back. We're glad you're here. Most of our videos are about camping, overlanding, road tripping, and exploring. While exploring, we come across lots of interesting natural features, histories, and oddities, but occasionally we come across something that really makes us stop and reflect. While exploring Indiana, we discovered two memorials dedicated to two plane crashes that occurred 34 years apart, one in northern Indiana and one in southern Indiana. In this video, we'll share the story of the plane crashes and the memorials created to remember and honor those lives lost. As we researched and learned more about both of these events that took place over 30 years apart and at opposite ends of the state, we were surprised by the number of similarities between the two. Maybe there are some lessons to be learned here. Before we get started, a little disclaimer that neither of us are experts on this topic. We're just travelers who happen to come across these memorials. We just thought we would share what we discovered, the questions that it raises for us, and then let you draw your own conclusions. The first memorial honors the memory of those lost when American Eagle Flight 4184 crashed on Halloween evening, October 31st, 1994, on its way from Indy to Chicago, a flight that would usually take approximately an hour. The plane took off from the Indianapolis airport with 64 passengers and 4 crew members, the pilot, first officer, and 2 flight attendants. For one of the flight attendants, this was her first on-the-job flight. It was 45 degrees on the ground that afternoon, but it got colder at higher elevations and there was a light drizzle. The plane was put into a holding pattern over northern Indiana while they waited for clearance to land at O'Hare. While in the holding pattern, the twin-engine turboprop began to develop or build up ice on the wings. There was a de-icer, and the pilot and first officer were aware of the issue and knew what they needed to do. As they attempted to leave the holding pattern, things went wrong. I won't try to explain the specifics of what happened in the next few minutes, as again, this isn't my field and much of this is over my head. But the plane flipped completely upside down at one point. The pilots were able to right it before it flipped upside down again and crashed into a soybean field in Roselawn, Indiana at about 4:57 p.m. It crashed with such speed and force that both the plane and the passengers disintegrated on contact with the ground. Wreckage was scattered over a huge area and it was declared a biohazard. It is considered one of the deadliest crashes of this type of plane, an ATR-72 aircraft. Both the pilot and first officer were experienced and deemed competent. When the investigation into the crash began, there were several organizations and agencies involved. And of course, at first, pilot error was looked at, and there were some arguments that it was human error. But ultimately, the NTSB deemed it to be a problem with icing on the plane and the functionality of the plane under those conditions. They cited fault in both the plane manufacturer and the FAA. The plane manufacturer for not disclosing that this is a known issue and for not updating their training manuals so pilots could be adequately trained. And the FAA for not upholding higher standards as far as safety in the de-icing systems go. So basically, this was a known issue, which would tend to raise the question, couldn't this have been prevented? And so it's easy to imagine how devastating this might be to the families, but it sounds like what happened after was even more heartbreaking. The airline's reaction and response to the family seemed to be indifference. The media was given updates about the investigation before the families. Personal belongings were mixed up and given to the wrong families, and perhaps the biggest slight was when the airline made the decision to bury the remains in a Maryville cemetery without informing the families. For anyone not familiar with the area, Maryville is a larger city about 30 minutes north of Roselawn. I can't even imagine what family members went through, but it eventually led to change in how plane crashes are handled. The families of these passengers and how they were treated led to the creation of the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act. The families of these passengers were instrumental in the passage of that act. This act guaranteed that crash victims' families would be informed of developments in crashes like this. Now airlines have to fly families to crash sites, put them up in hotels. The NTSB has to give regular briefings to the family before the press, and experts are brought in to identify bodies as needed. We are from this area, and remember when this crash happened 30 years ago now. We first visited the site probably about 10 years after it happened, and there was a smaller memorial. The memorial that is here now was unveiled on the 20th anniversary of the crash, and it sounds like it took a lot of effort to bring about its creation. We visited the memorial on a cold, windy, rainy day in April. The second memorial we discovered while exploring southern Indiana honors the passenger and crew of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 710. While we had some prior knowledge about the American Airlines crash, we had never heard of this one, and when we began learning more about it, we were really surprised by some of the similarities and coincidences between the two plane crashes. Northwest Orient Flight 710 had left Minneapolis-St. Paul on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1960, and had a stopover at Midway. So it was headed south from Midway to Miami when it crashed in southern Indiana just outside the town of Cannelton. Their last radio contact was with Indy about 3 p.m., and the plane broke up in air about 15 minutes later. The plane was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, and this was the third disaster involving an Electra in a little over a year. The plane had encountered quite a bit of turbulence over southern Indiana, and some people reported seeing the right wing fall off of the plane midair. Similar to the American Eagle flight, this caused the plane to crash with such speed and force that, again, both plane and passengers were disintegrated. And again, it was spread over such a large area, but here in southern Indiana, it was a little more wooded. This was before the NTSB was formed in 1967, so it was investigated by the Civil Aeronautics Board, and they thought there were 3 possible causes. The first was a bomb because someone had called in and claimed that there had been a bomb. It was also investigated as 2 planes crashing because debris was spread over such a large area they thought there must have been 2 planes. The wing and 2 of the engines were found over 5 miles away from the main crash site. It was eventually determined to be a structural failure. And again, I won't try to explain the specifics, but it's what the Lockheed engineers called freak vibration phenomena. So this is something to do with the vibrations created by the propellers, matching the frequency of the wings and causing catastrophic stresses. This wasn't the first L-188 Electra to crash. 6 months earlier, another one had crashed in Buffalo. 1960, of course, was a much different time from 1994, but similarly, many of the family members learned about the plane crash through the media. The residents of the surrounding community were desperate to do something to help the families, although there was little they could do under the circumstances. So the decision was made to erect a memorial in their honor and to sort of designate that as sacred ground. And a year later, this memorial was dedicated. It's known as the Kiwanis Electra Memorial because, along with the citizens of Perry County, the Kiwanis Club was instrumental in raising the funds for the memorial. So there are some interesting and kind of thought-provoking similarities or coincidences between the two plane crashes. Both of them happened on holidays, although different holidays, Halloween and St. Patrick's Day. They were similar size planes, with the ATR having a capacity of about 78 passengers, and the Lockheed had a capacity of about 99, so a little bit bigger. An interesting coincidence that I hadn't mentioned is that both planes had only been in service for 7 months. The American Eagle plane had been put into service of March 1994 and then crashed in October, and the Electra had been put into service in September and then crashed in March of 1960. One of the most unfortunate similarities is the type of crash itself, one that is so devastating that remains can't be identified. In this situation, families are sometimes given something from their loved ones that they can take home, but for many, the crash site is where they feel closest. In 2010, Perry County held a service at the memorial to commemorate the 50th anniversary. One of the family members is quoted as saying, "Remember, there's no gravesite for me," reminding us that for many of the family members, this is the gravesite they'll visit. In both cases, the remains that could be collected were buried at nearby cemeteries, but there aren't individual graves for each of the passengers. Probably the most troubling coincidence is that both of these seem to be problems that there was some knowledge of before the crashes occurred, which raises the question of whether they could have been prevented. I was watching a movie the other day, and one of the characters said something to the effect, "I hate when companies bring products to people that aren't ready for people yet." And that did really make me think about how so often companies do put profit above people. At the end of videos, I usually say, I hope you enjoyed coming along with us, or I hope you enjoyed this video, but that seems a little inappropriate here, so I'll just say thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.